Take the junk, mechanic. Maybe your daughter can play in it. The words slipped from Vivian Whitmore's mouth with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. And for one brief second, even the champagne glasses inside Whitmore Hall seemed to stop trembling. Caleb Mercer stood beneath the gold lights of the estate ballroom, one hand resting gently on the shoulder of his 8-year-old daughter, Ellie, while nearly 200 guests turned to stare at the man in the faded denim jacket and oil-stained work boots. He had not come for attention. He had not come to beg. He had driven 30 miles in his old Ford pickup because the late Charles Whitmore's estate sale had listed a small wooden toolbox among the cheaper items, and Caleb thought maybe, just maybe, it might hold something useful for his little garage beside the railroad tracks. But men like Preston Vale had a way of smelling poverty in a room full of perfume. "Careful, Vivian," Preston said, loud enough for everyone near the marble staircase to hear. "If you give him anything with wheels, he might try to live in it." A few people laughed. Then more joined in, because rich rooms often laugh before they think. Ellie's fingers tightened around the sleeve of her father's jacket. Caleb did not look down at her right away. He knew if he saw the hurt in her eyes, he might have to swallow more than pride. Vivian stood near a long table covered with her father's watches, cuff links, framed photographs, and polished awards. Each one tagged and priced like memory could be measured in dollars. She was 32, beautiful in a pearl-white dress, with her blonde hair pulled back and her chin lifted the way people lift shields. Her father had been buried 6 days earlier, but grief had not softened her. It had made her colder. Beyond the ballroom windows, through the mist and the late October drizzle, an old carriage barn sat at the edge of the estate. Inside it, beneath a torn canvas tarp, rested a rusted car no one had bothered to list properly. Its tires were flat. Its hood was scarred with brown patches. The chrome was dull, the windshield cloudy, the body sagging under dust and years of neglect. To Vivian, it was an embarrassment her father had refused to throw away. To Preston, it was the perfect punchline. "Give him that old thing," Preston said. "Call it charity." Vivian's eyes moved from Caleb's boots to Ellie's patched blue coat, then back to Caleb's calm face. "Fine," she said. "Mr. Mercer, my father kept a useless car in the barn for reasons none of us understood. If you can haul it away, it is yours." A murmur passed through the guests. Phones rose. Smirks spread. Someone whispered that the poor mechanic had just won a pile of rust. Caleb looked past them all toward the dark shape under the tarp. He could have refused. He could have defended himself. He could have told them that his daughter understood kindness better than every polished adult in that room. Instead, he removed his cap, held it in both hands, and spoke in a voice quiet enough to make the nearest people lean in. "If it belonged to your father, ma'am, it deserves respect." The laughter weakened, not because they understood him, but because dignity has a strange way of making cruelty feel overdressed. Ellie looked up at him, her eyes wet but steady. Vivian's smile faltered for less than a heartbeat. Caleb signed the transfer paper Preston pushed at him, folded it once, and placed it carefully inside his jacket. Outside, rain tapped softly against the old barn roof as he pulled back the tarp and saw the forgotten car for the first time. Everyone else saw rust. Caleb saw hand-shaped body lines, a strange hood emblem nearly buried beneath corrosion, and a locked glove box that looked as if it had not been opened in 20 years. He said nothing. He simply placed his palm on the cold metal, as gently as a man touching a grave, while behind him the wealthy guests kept laughing. None of them knew that under that rust slept a secret worth $9 million. And none of them knew that by sunrise, the joke would begin turning back toward the people who told it. By the time Caleb Mercer got the rusted car chained to the back of his old Ford and started down the long gravel drive away from Whitmore Estate, the rain had turned thin and silver, sliding across the windshield in nervous little lines. Ellie sat beside him with her hands folded around the edge of her seat belt, staring through the rear window at the shape of the car following them like a tired animal being led home. For nearly a mile, neither of them spoke. The estate disappeared behind black iron gates, then behind wet trees, then behind the kind of darkness that makes rich houses look like rumors. Caleb kept both hands on the wheel. His jaw was calm. His eyes were tired. But inside him, something old had been stirred. "Daddy," Ellie finally whispered, "why did they laugh at us?" Caleb let the question sit in the cab for a moment. The heater clicked. The wipers dragged. Somewhere behind them, the trailer hitch groaned under the weight of the forgotten machine. Because some people think being poor means being small, he said gently. Ellie looked down at her patched blue coat. Are we small? Caleb glanced at her then, and the softness in his face returned. No, sweetheart. We are just quiet. She nodded as if trying to understand the difference. Outside, the road narrowed toward the old railroad district where Caleb rented a two-bay garage with a tin roof, a cracked concrete floor, and a hand-painted sign that read Mercer Auto Repair. Most people passed it without slowing down unless their truck was smoking or their brakes were crying. But to Caleb, it was shelter. It was work. It was the place where he had raised a child between oil changes, school lunches, unpaid bills, and bedtime prayers whispered over the hum of an air compressor. When they pulled in, the security light buzzed awake above the garage door, spilling pale yellow across the rusted car. It looked worse under that honest light. The paint was blistered. The front grille hung crooked. Mud clung to the wheel wells. A neighbor across the alley, Mr. Donnelly, stepped onto his porch with a cup of coffee and let out a low whistle. Caleb, tell me you did not pay real money for that corpse. Caleb climbed out and unhooked the chains. Did not pay a dime. Still might have overpaid, Donnelly muttered, shaking his head before going back inside. Ellie frowned, but Caleb only smiled a little. He had heard worse from cleaner shoes. Together, father and daughter pushed the car into the garage, inch by inch, while rain ticked on the roof like fingers asking to be let in. The place smelled of motor oil, old pine shelves, damp cardboard, and the faint sweetness of the cocoa mix Caleb kept for Ellie in a tin by the office desk. Once the car was settled beneath the hanging shop lights, Caleb wiped his hands and stood still. He did not touch it right away. There was a kind of respect in waiting. Ellie watched him from beside the tool bench. Are you mad at that lady? She asked. Caleb exhaled through his nose, slow and careful. No, she was mean. Yes, he said. But mean people are usually carrying something they do not know how to set down. Ellie thought about that, then looked at the car. What are we going to do with it? Caleb picked up a clean rag, dipped it in warm water, and began wiping a small circle on the hood. We are going to see what it really is. The rag moved once, twice, 3 times. Rust dust streaked brown across his knuckles. A layer of grime gave way near the front edge of the hood, revealing a sliver of deep midnight blue paint underneath, so rich and smooth it seemed impossible that it had survived beneath all that decay. Caleb stopped. The garage grew quiet except for the rain. He leaned closer, his breath slowing. Beneath the blue, barely visible under corrosion, was a small emblem shaped like a raven in flight. Not stamped, not glued, hand-cast. Caleb had worked on cars since he was 15 years old, and he had never seen anything like it. Ellie stepped beside him. Is that good? She whispered. Caleb did not answer at first. He looked toward the locked glove box, then at the unusual curve of the hood, then back at the raven waiting beneath the rust. Finally, he said softly, it means somebody loved this car before they forgot it. And for the first time that night, the thing Vivian Whitmore had called junk began to feel less like a joke and more like a secret trying to breathe. Caleb did not sleep much that night. After Ellie curled up on the small office couch beneath an old quilt, he stayed under the shop lights with the rusted car and a silence that felt almost alive. The rain softened after midnight, becoming a slow whisper against the tin roof, and every now and then a freight train rolled somewhere beyond the buildings, shaking the glass in the garage windows. Caleb moved carefully, not like a man tearing apart scrap, but like someone reading a letter written in a language he had almost forgotten. He cleaned the hood first, then the left fender, then the edge of the driver's door. The midnight blue paint appeared in broken islands beneath the rust, deep and strange, the kind of color no factory would waste on an ordinary car. At 2 a.m, he found the first real clue. A small metal plate near the firewall had been painted over, then scratched, then hidden beneath a layer of grease, so old it had hardened like tar. Caleb warmed it with a shop lamp, softened the grime, and wiped it clean with the corner of a rag. 3 markings emerged under the light. W. Raven, 001. Caleb stared at them for a long time. He knew production codes. He knew restoration tags. He knew the language of American steel, from old Chevys to forgotten Fords to rare custom builds that men talked about in diners like campfire legends. But this was different. This was not a model number meant for a showroom. It looked like a prototype. He stepped back, rubbed both hands over his face, and let the quiet settle around him. "What are you?" he whispered. The car, of course, did not answer. But sometimes old things speak without words. By sunrise, Ellie woke to the smell of burnt coffee and machine oil. She found her father lying halfway under the dashboard with a flashlight between his teeth and a wrench in his hand. "Daddy." He slid out slowly, blinking at the pale morning light. "Good morning, sweetheart. Did the car tell you anything?" Caleb almost smiled. "A little." She climbed down from the couch, still wrapped in the quilt, and walked around the car with sleepy seriousness. On the passenger side, she noticed the glove box. Its small chrome lock was dull but untouched. "This is locked," she said. "Most glove boxes are. But this one looks like it is hiding." Caleb looked over. Children had a way of saying true things before adults were brave enough to admit them. He worked the lock gently with a thin pick from his tool chest. It took him 15 careful minutes. He refused to break it. There was dignity even in opening what the past had closed. When the latch finally clicked, Ellie held her breath. The glove box dropped open with a soft creak, releasing the smell of dust, old leather, and time. Inside was no registration, no insurance card, no forgotten map. There was only a faded photograph sealed in a cracked plastic sleeve. Ellie reached for it, then looked at her father for permission. Caleb nodded. She pulled it free and held it under the light. The picture showed two young men standing beside the same car when it was new, its blue paint shining like evening sky after rain. One man was unmistakably Charles Whitmore, younger, smiling in a rolled-up white shirt with grease on his forearms. The other man stood half-turned toward the camera, taller, leaner, with kind eyes and a mechanic's cap pulled low. Caleb's breath caught. His hand moved before his mind could stop it. He took the photograph gently, as if the paper itself might bruise. He knew that face, not from life, because he had been too young when his father died, but from the small framed picture his mother had kept beside her Bible. Daniel Mercer, his father. For a moment, the garage seemed to tilt around him. The buzzing lights, the rain-stained windows, the cold concrete floor, all of it faded beneath the weight of a name that had not been spoken in years. Ellie touched his sleeve. "Daddy, is that Grandpa Daniel?" Caleb swallowed hard. He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in blue ink that had faded but not disappeared, were the words, "For the daughter who may one day learn what value really means." Caleb stood perfectly still. Outside, the first sunlight slipped through the dirty shop window and touched the raven emblem on the hood. And in that quiet little garage by the railroad tracks, the rusty car stopped being Vivian Whitmore's joke and became Caleb Mercer's inheritance. By late morning, Caleb had placed the photograph inside a clean plastic sleeve and set it on the workbench beside. The raven emblem he had carefully polished free of grime. He had not told anyone outside that garage what he had found. Not Mr. Donnelly. Not the parts supplier who called about an overdue invoice. Not even Vivian Whitmore, whose name now seemed heavier than it had the night before. He only told Ellie that some truths needed to be handled like old glass, slowly, with both hands. She sat at the desk doing her spelling homework, though her eyes kept drifting back to the photograph of her grandfather standing beside Charles Whitmore. Caleb was reaching for the glove box again when tires crunched across the gravel outside. Not one car. 3. The sound was too smooth, too expensive, too sure of itself. A black Range Rover stopped first, then a white production van, then Preston Vale's silver Mercedes. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag and stepped toward the open bay door. Vivian got out wearing a camel-colored coat and dark sunglasses, her blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears, her face arranged into something that looked almost kind but did not reach her eyes. Preston followed with two young people carrying cameras, a woman with a tablet, and a man holding a small microphone like it was a royal invitation. "Mr. Mercer," Vivian called, her voice polished for public use. "We thought we might stop by and see how you were enjoying my father's gift." Caleb looked at the cameras, then at Preston's smile. "Looks like you brought more than curiosity." Preston chuckled and stepped inside without asking. "Do not be difficult, Caleb. Vivian is launching a memorial foundation this week. A simple human interest piece. Billionaire Heiress gives forgotten vehicle to hard-working local single father. It is warm. It is humble. It makes everyone look good." Ellie stood in the office doorway, clutching her pencil. Caleb saw her and softened his voice. Everyone. Preston glanced at the little girl, then back at Caleb. Well, mostly Vivian. One of the camera operators lifted his lens toward the car. Caleb raised a hand, not angry, just firm. No filming. The garage quieted. Vivian removed her sunglasses. Excuse me. No filming my daughter. No filming my shop. No filming that car. Preston's smile thinned. You accepted charity in front of 200 witnesses. Now you want privacy. Caleb folded the rag once, then set it on the hood with care. I accepted a car you said was mine. A worthless car, Preston said. A prop, really. Do not confuse a joke with ownership. Ellie's eyes dropped to the concrete. Caleb took one slow step between her and the visitors. The shop lights hummed above them. The smell of rain-damp rubber, coffee, and old steel sat heavy in the room. Vivian looked around for the first time as if she had expected filth and found order instead. Every tool hung in its place. Every rag was folded. Even the rusted car sat beneath the light with a strange dignity, no longer abandoned, no longer quite asleep. We are not trying to humiliate you, Vivian said, though her voice was not as certain now. Caleb looked at her, calm enough to make the words land harder. Then why does your camera need my poverty to tell your story? No one spoke. Preston gave a short laugh, but it fell flat against the concrete walls. Listen, mechanic, people like you should be grateful when people like her remember you exist. Ellie flinched. Caleb did not. He only bent, picked up the towel Preston had brushed from the fender, and laid it gently back across the blue paint as if covering a wound. We do not need your camera to be human, he said. Vivian's face changed then, barely, but enough. Her eyes moved from Caleb's steady hands to Ellie's small, trembling chin, then to the old photograph on the workbench. Caleb noticed and turned slightly, blocking her view, but not before she saw the younger face of her father standing beside the shining blue car, smiling like a man she had never known. For the first time since she walked into the garage, Vivian Whitmore stopped performing. Where did you get that? She asked softly. Caleb held her gaze. From the glove box. Preston stepped forward too quickly. Put the camera away, he snapped, suddenly no longer amused. And in that small, oil-scented garage, Caleb understood something with cold clarity. Preston was not afraid of embarrassment. He was afraid of what the dead had left behind. Preston's order landed too fast, too sharp, and everyone in the garage felt it. The camera operator lowered his lens. The woman with the tablet stopped typing. Vivian turned toward Preston with a slow confusion that looked almost like waking up. Why? She asked. Preston adjusted his cuffs, but his eyes stayed on the photograph. Because this is no longer useful. It is messy. We should go. Caleb did not move. Ellie stood behind him with one hand on the office doorframe, watching the adults the way children watch storms, not understanding the pressure in the air, but knowing when the sky has changed. Vivian stepped closer to the workbench. That is my father, she said, her voice quieter now. He never smiled like that in photographs. Caleb looked down at the image of Charles Whitmore and Daniel Mercer beside the blue car, two young men with grease on their sleeves and hope in their faces. Maybe he did before the world taught him not to. Vivian swallowed, and for the first time, the polished heiress looked less like marble and more like a daughter standing in front of a locked room. Preston reached for the photograph. Caleb's hand came down over it first, calm but final. Do not. Preston's jaw tightened. That belongs to the Whitmore estate. Caleb pulled the transfer paper from inside his jacket and placed it beside the photograph. So did the car. Until last night. The silence that followed was not loud, but it was heavy. Vivian looked at the paper, then at Caleb, then at the car her father had hidden under canvas for years. Is there more? She asked. Caleb hesitated. He could have said no. He could have kept the discovery to himself, let pride answer pride, let the joke become his advantage. But Caleb Mercer had not been raised that way. He walked to the driver's side, opened the door, and reached beneath the lower edge of the dashboard where he had felt a strange seam earlier that morning. With a flat screwdriver and steady pressure, he loosened a narrow panel no wider than a license plate. It came free with a tired click. Behind it sat a metal tube wrapped in oilcloth. Vivian took one step forward, then stopped as if the floor itself had warned her to be careful. Caleb unwrapped the tube and found an envelope sealed with brittle wax. On the front, in faded blue ink, were 4 words, for Vivian, when ready. The color drained from her face. Preston whispered, "Do not open that here." Vivian did not look at him. Why not? Because grief makes people misunderstand things. Caleb handed her the envelope without ceremony. His fingers were rough, marked by work. Hers trembled, marked by a life that had rarely required asking permission. She broke the seal. The paper inside smelled faintly of dust, cedar, and something older than money. Her father's handwriting covered the page in careful lines. She began reading silently, but after the first sentence, her breath broke. Caleb looked away to give her privacy, but her voice rose, fragile and unwilling. "My dearest Vivian, if this car has found daylight, then perhaps truth has finally outlived my fear." Preston stepped backward. Vivian kept reading. Charles Whitmore wrote of a young mechanic named Daniel Mercer, the only man who believed an American Grand Touring car could be built with beauty, speed, and soul instead of ego. He wrote that Daniel was not an employee but a partner, a brother in all but blood. He wrote that the Raven was their shared dream, and that after Daniel died during a late-night testing failure, Charles allowed lawyers, investors, and fear to erase Daniel's name from every record. Caleb closed his eyes. Ellie reached for his hand. Vivian's voice shook harder. "I built an empire with the world's applause, but the finest thing I ever built was hidden in a barn because I was too ashamed to face the family of the man who helped me build it." No one moved. Even Preston seemed to forget his performance. Vivian lowered the letter, tears shining but not falling. She looked at Caleb as if seeing him for the first time, not as a poor mechanic, not as a charity story, not as the punchline of a cruel evening, but as the son of the man her father had failed. Caleb's voice was low. "Daniel Mercer was my father." The words did not echo, but they changed the room. Vivian pressed the letter to her chest. Outside, a train passed in the distance, its horn carrying through the gray afternoon like a long, mournful amen. And under the shop lights, the rusty car seemed to stand between two families, not asking to be sold, not asking to be praised, only asking that the truth finally be brave enough to stay. Preston broke the silence first, and the kindness in the room seemed to pull away from him like light from a closing door. "This is sentimental nonsense," he said, smoothing his tie with fingers that were not as steady as he wanted them to be. Vivian turned slowly. "My father wrote that letter." "Your father was grieving over an old accident," Preston replied. "People confess to things in private that have no legal meaning." Caleb watched him carefully. He had known men like Preston before, men who smiled in public and measured people by what could be taken from them in private. Vivian folded the letter with trembling care, but her eyes stayed on Preston. "You knew there was something in this car." Preston's face hardened by half an inch. "I knew your father wasted too much attention on useless relics when there were assets to protect." "Assets," Vivian repeated, as if the word tasted wrong. "That is what you call this?" Preston stepped closer to her, lowering his voice, though everyone could still hear. "I call it a problem. That transfer paper was a joke. You were upset. The estate can reverse it. We will claim confusion, emotional distress, improper valuation, whatever the attorneys prefer. Mr. Mercer will be compensated fairly for towing and storage." Ellie's hand tightened around Caleb's. Caleb did not answer. The old shop clock ticked above the office door. A drop of water fell somewhere from a leak in the tin roof, tapping into a coffee can with patient rhythm. Vivian looked from Preston to Caleb, and Caleb could see the battle inside her. The old world of reputation, lawyers, headlines, and family control fighting against one handwritten letter from the father she had barely known. "Caleb," she said softly, "I need time." Preston seized the opening. "Exactly. You need time away from this garage." He turned to his assistant. "Call Harlan and Briggs. Emergency estate recovery. And notify county storage if needed." Caleb's voice came quiet. "You are going to sue me for a gift you laughed at?" Preston smiled then, not warmly, but with relief that the conversation had returned to power. "No, Mr. Mercer. We are going to protect a billion-dollar family from a mechanic who suddenly discovered ambition." The words struck Ellie harder than they struck Caleb. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Caleb knelt beside her, placing both hands on her small shoulders. "Did we do something wrong?" she whispered. He looked at her the way a father looks when he wants his child to remember truth more than pain. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes truth gets locked up before it gets heard." By 3 that afternoon, A courier delivered a temporary injunction to Mercer Auto Repair. By 4, a county clerk arrived with 2 officers and a polite expression that made the humiliation worse. They did not touch Caleb. They did not raise their voices. They only taped a notice across the garage door stating that the vehicle inside was under legal dispute and could not be moved, altered, sold, or restored. Mr. Donnelly watched from his porch in silence. The parts supplier slowed his truck, then drove on. A boy on a bicycle stopped at the alley mouth and stared until his mother called him away. Caleb stood in the rain with Ellie tucked beneath his jacket, reading the notice once, then twice, while behind the glass bay door the Raven sat half-cleaned, half-buried, as if the past itself had been arrested. Vivian remained beside her Range Rover, pale and unmoving, the letter still pressed inside her coat. Preston stood near her, speaking into his phone about legal exposure and proprietary design history. But when Caleb looked at Vivian, he saw that she was no longer listening to Preston. She was staring at the sealed garage, at the old car, at the place where her father's truth had almost breathed. Caleb lifted his cap to her, not in surrender, but in quiet respect, then guided Ellie toward the pickup. Vivian took one step as if to call after him, then stopped. Rain beaded on her pearl-white sleeves. For the first time in her life, all her money could open every door except the one her own pride had helped. Close. The public appraisal was scheduled for Friday morning inside Whitmore Hall, though everyone in town understood it was not really an appraisal anymore. It had become a test of reputation, money, and truth. By 9 o'clock, the same ballroom that had laughed at Caleb Mercer 3 days earlier was filled again with polished shoes, low voices, and cameras pretending not to be hungry. The gold lights still glowed above the marble floor. The champagne tables were gone. In their place stood a long velvet rope, 2 legal teams, 3 reporters from Cleveland, and the half-cleaned Raven resting beneath a soft gray cover at the center of the room like a witness waiting to speak. Caleb arrived with Ellie at his side, wearing the same denim jacket, freshly washed but still old enough to remember honest work. Some guests turned when he entered. A few whispered. One man gave him the pitying look people give when they think kindness has walked into a room where it cannot win. Caleb did not lower his eyes. Ellie held his hand and walked with the careful bravery of a child who had already learned that adults can be cruel when they are embarrassed. Vivian stood near the front beside Preston, dressed in black, her face pale, her posture straight but no longer proud. In her hand, folded and refolded, was her father's letter. Preston leaned toward her and murmured, "Let Bellamy speak. Let the lawyers confirm estate interest. Then we end this cleanly." Vivian did not answer. Across the room, Arthur Bellamy removed his gloves from his coat pocket. He was nearly 70, with silver hair, round glasses, and the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life listening to old machines tell the truth. He nodded once to Vivian, once to Caleb, then turned to the covered car. "Before I begin," he said, "I want this room to understand something. Rust is not evidence of worthlessness. Sometimes rust is only time asking for patience." The room quieted in a way Caleb recognized. Not respect yet. Curiosity. Arthur pulled the cover back. The Raven appeared under the ballroom lights, still bruised by age, still scarred by neglect, but changed enough that the midnight blue paint shone through in places like sky showing between storm clouds. Arthur began with the frame. He named the hand-welded seams, the uncommon suspension geometry, the one-off dashboard layout. He pointed to the plate Caleb had uncovered. "W Raven 001, he read aloud. A reporter's pen stopped moving. Preston shifted. Arthur continued, "This is not a kit car. It is not a damaged production model. It is a hand-built American prototype, almost certainly constructed between 1971 and 1973. Preston laughed softly. "Almost certainly is not a valuation." Arthur looked at him over his glasses. "No, Mr. Vale. That is why I brought the archive." His assistant opened a leather case and spread several protected documents across the table. Design sketches, engine notes, old photographs, and a yellowed workshop invoice bearing 2 signatures. Charles Whitmore, Daniel Mercer. The room changed again. Vivian's lips parted. Caleb looked down, not in shame, but because grief sometimes arrives dressed as proof. Arthur lifted one of the sketches. These drawings were believed destroyed. They identify the Raven project as a private Whitmore Mercer prototype program. 2 builders. 2 signatures. 1 surviving car. Preston stepped forward. Those papers have not been authenticated. They have, Arthur said. By ink dating, paper analysis, and matching notations from the Whitmore corporate archive. A silence spread from the front row to the back like a slow hand lowering every voice. Vivian turned to Preston. You told me there were no records. Preston's smile stayed in place, but only because pride was holding it there. I told you there were no useful records. Caleb felt Ellie press closer to him. Arthur walked to the driver's side, opened the door, and pointed beneath the floor panel. There is one more compartment. I asked that it remain sealed until both families were present. Both families. The words landed gently, but they struck deeper than any accusation. Caleb and Vivian looked at each other across the car, 2 children of 2 fathers, standing at opposite ends of the same unfinished truth. Arthur handed Caleb the small tool. Caleb looked to Vivian. She nodded. He knelt, turned the screws with steady hands, and lifted the panel free. Inside rested a narrow metal box, untouched by dust, wrapped in the same oilcloth as the letter. Preston's face lost color. Stop, he said. No one moved toward him. No one laughed. Not this time. Caleb lifted the box into the light, and the entire ballroom held its breath. Caleb held the metal box with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because every person in Whitmore Hall seemed to understand that what lay inside it could outweigh money. Arthur Bellamy stepped closer and examined the old seal on the latch. This has not been opened in decades, he said. Vivian's fingers tightened around her father's letter. Preston stood 3 feet away, pale beneath the ballroom lights, his polished confidence cracking at the edges. You have no authority to open that, he said. His voice was sharp, but it no longer sounded large. Arthur looked toward Vivian. Miss Whitmore, as legal heir to Charles Whitmore's personal estate, and Mr. Mercer, as documented family party to the Raven Project, I advise that you open it together. For a moment, neither moved. Then Vivian crossed the marble floor slowly. No cameras flashing now, no whispers rising. Only the soft sound of her heels approaching the poor mechanic she had once mocked in that same room. Caleb did not smile. He simply turned the box so the latch faced them both. Vivian placed one trembling hand beside his. Together, they opened it. Inside was a small reel-to-reel tape, a stack of folded papers, and a black velvet pouch containing the original Raven Hood badge, bright silver and untouched by rust. Arthur lifted the papers first. His eyes moved across the top page, then stopped. Patent assignments, he said softly. Equal ownership. Charles Whitmore and Daniel Mercer. A murmur broke out, then died when Arthur raised the next document. An evaluation history. Offers from private collectors. The most recent insured estimate, adjusted for rarity and provenance, places the restored vehicle at approximately $9 million. The number moved through the room like thunder without sound. $9 million. The guests who had laughed 3 nights earlier looked toward the car, as if it had become sacred and dangerous at once. Vivian shut her eyes, and when she opened them, they were full of shame. Preston tried to recover first. That estimate is speculative. The estate will contest chain of ownership. Arthur turned to him. That may be difficult, given this. He held up the final folded paper. It was not addressed to Vivian. It was addressed to whoever found the truth after Charles was gone. Arthur read only the necessary part, his voice clean and steady. Charles Whitmore had written that Daniel Mercer's share of the Raven Project was never paid, never honored, and never forgotten. If the car survived, he wanted Daniel's family recognized publicly and compensated fully before any Whitmore heir profited from it. Caleb looked down at Ellie. She was staring at the Raven, not with greed, but with wonder, as if she had just discovered that her grandfather's hands were still speaking through metal. Then Vivian reached for the tape. Can it be played? Arthur nodded to his assistant, who brought forward an old restored recorder. Preston stepped back. Vivian, enough. She looked at him then, and all the daughter in her voice disappeared, leaving only the woman who had finally found her spine. No, Preston. Enough was when you told me my father left nothing but junk. The tape began with a hiss. Then Charles Whitmore's voice filled the ballroom. Older, tired, unmistakably real. He spoke of the Raven. He spoke of Daniel Mercer. Then his voice lowered as he described forged board approvals, shell companies, and a plan to sell Whitmore assets after his death through entities secretly controlled by Preston Vale. No one breathed. Preston whispered, "That is manipulated." But his denial arrived too late. Arthur had the documents. Vivian had the letter. The room had heard the voice of a dead man saying what the living had tried to bury. Two attorneys near the front exchanged glances. A reporter lowered her phone, stunned into decency. Vivian turned toward Preston, not with rage, but with something colder and cleaner. "You used my grief to steal my father's company." Preston opened his mouth, but no sentence came out that could still wear a suit. Security did not rush. No one shouted. Two Whitmore legal officers simply stepped beside him and asked him to wait in the adjoining office until counsel arrived. That was all. Sometimes justice does not need noise. Sometimes it only needs truth spoken in a room that once laughed. As Preston was led away, Caleb placed the original silver badge on the Raven's hood. It caught the light, and for one breath, the rusted car looked almost whole. Vivian faced Caleb and Ellie before everyone. Her lips trembled. "I am sorry," she said. Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Not forgiveness yet, but a door opened. And throughout Whitmore Hall, from the marble stairs to the velvet ropes, there was no laughter left anywhere. For a long moment after Preston was taken from the ballroom, no one seemed to know what to do with their hands, their eyes, or their shame. The same people who had laughed at Caleb Mercer now stood around the Raven as if the old car had become a mirror, and none of them liked what it showed. Vivian remained in front of Caleb and Ellie, her apology still hanging between them, small but real. Caleb looked at the silver badge resting on the hood, then at the letter in Vivian's hand, then at his daughter. He could have asked for everything right then. Money, ownership, public correction, every dollar owed to the Mercer name. But dignity had never taught Caleb to grab. It had taught him to hold steady until truth could stand on its own. "Your father wanted Daniel Mercer remembered," he said quietly. Vivian nodded, tears finally slipping down her face without performance, without makeup-perfect control. "Then we remember them both." 3 months later, the Raven no longer sat in a courtroom of opinion or under a dusty tarp in a barn. It stood beneath the morning sun outside a restored brick building near the railroad district, its midnight blue paint shining deep and alive, its chrome bright, its Raven badge gleaming like a promise kept. Above the wide garage doors hung a new sign, Mercer Whitmore Restoration School. The opening crowd was smaller than Vivian's estate gala, but it was better. Single fathers in work jackets stood beside single mothers holding toddlers. Veterans leaned on canes and laughed softly with teenagers who had never held a wrench before. Old mechanics wiped their eyes and pretended it was the cold. Ellie stood near the front in a blue dress, holding a framed photograph of Daniel Mercer and Charles Whitmore beside the car when it was young. Vivian stood next to Caleb, not above him, not in front of him, but beside him, dressed simply, her hair moving in the spring wind. The $9 million valuation had made headlines, but Caleb refused to sell the Raven. Instead, with Vivian's help and the legal settlement from the recovered Whitmore assets, they turned its value into something that could not be parked behind velvet ropes. Free training, honest work, second chances, a place where people who had been laughed at could learn to build something strong with their own hands. When Caleb stepped to the microphone, the crowd quieted. He did not give a polished speech. He never needed polished words. "My father helped build this car," he said. "Mr. Whitmore helped hide it. But in the end, the truth found daylight anyway. Maybe that is what grace does. It waits under the rust until someone is patient enough to uncover it." Vivian lowered her eyes, not from shame this time, but from respect. Ellie tugged her father's sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, why did everyone laugh at it?" Caleb looked at the Raven, then at Vivian, then at the students waiting by the open garage doors. Because some people only see rust before they learn how to see grace. The wind moved softly through the crowd. No one clapped right away. They just stood there in that holy little silence where pride dies and understanding begins. Then one pair of hands started, then another, until the applause rose warm and steady, not for money, not for revenge, but for a quiet man who never had to become cruel to prove he was strong. And if this story touched something in you, tell us in the comments what you would have done if you were Caleb, and whether you believe some forgotten things are only waiting for the right hands to reveal their worth. Thank you for watching until the end.